How do we, as the Earth's spirit people, shift to where spirituality is no longer a mystery to us? Because we created it in the sense of we are the originators of the acknowledgement of there being more than just the physical and just being more than just who we see. But we've lost it. We've lost connection. How do we get back to that?
We were miseducated out of our connection. So the way to correct it is through education.
And I think we've tried to go online and try to Google African spiritual systems to try to get understanding. It's not out there.
Google is not owned by Africa.
Understood. But that's where we primarily get our information from, is on the internet. So,
in fact, if you were to go on Google and look for spirituality, it should say, make your own spiritual Google, because this white people Google ain't going to answer it for you. So it comes down to you have to go and collect the cookie crumbs that your ancestors were forced to give up by edict of law. They banned the drum. They banned the dancing. They banned the beads. They banned the cowrie shells. They banned the conch shell. They banned all these ways that we used to communicate spiritual things with each other. Again, spirituality is not separate from the life of the Alkebu-Lan person. What the European did was they took charge of our souls. And what they said was, your soul needs to labor to go to white heaven. So therefore, the soul that's inside of you right now, you need to use your body to forge that soul that's inside of you to obey our will. And that comes from the slave preaching created by Charles Calcutt Jones. That idea that enslavers needed to take huge portions of what it is they were trying to do with their day to give us religious instruction in order to turn us from our pagan ways towards the grace of Western European God.
So now that's normal. And Rhonda was talking about natural earlier on in the conversation. So what's the path from normal to natural?
You have to let it go. You got to let it go.
But every time I close my eyes and I pray, I see this, white bearded man that, is all cloudy looking.
You got to let it go.
I think it's a personal problem.
No, I used to see that dude too. It's the same dude that was reaching across the sky and touching Adam's finger.
Naked.
In the naked Adam. Is that the Sistine Chapel? That's Michelangelo, right? I used to always call that thing the 16 Chapel when I was growing up. What is it, Sistine or something? I don't even know what that
Sistine
means.
Chapel.
So whatever that means. Anyway. And then that the whole thing with the burning down of the Humpback of Notre Dame building or something. Oh, that was a fiasco, wasn't it? What we really want to talk, because this conversation is sucking so far. I don't know. I don't like the way it's going. What we really want to talk about is the Krakatoa that Botham Jean's brother experienced on the stand during the sentencing. And we want to look into the mental conditioning of Europeanized, westernized, weaponized religion as given to the underclass of enslaved Alkebu-Lan people with an expected payoff. And America got to see their payoff during that trial. America got to see the payoff. And I'm going to say this specifically. White America got to see the payoff of all of the Christianity that they forced into us. That is what they were looking for from the very beginning. Because an Alkebu-Lan person who understands that his God is not white Jesus or white Jesus's daddy is not going to behave like that.
I know the story, but I didn't read too much into what the court scene was. But I did see a picture today, and it was an Alkebu-Lan male that was identified as being the brother of the victim, embracing this murderer in a very forgiving fashion. So is that what we're talking about right now?
Yeah, I call it Krakatoa. The Krakatosis. I don't even know what Krakatoa. Krakatoa is like a like a mountain or something, a volcano.
Isn't that more
something.
like cooning or?
No, that was a personal choice by the brother. I think you're making it too big, Shabakojo. That's a very specific situation, very specific person.
But we see it widespread. Time and time again, we see that before the body is even cold, the family is already on camera forgiving the murderer without even having the full story.
I mean, that's not unique to Black people, though.
It's something that we've seen over and over again amongst our people, specifically in these type of situations where a family member has been killed by the police officers. And I always find it very interesting that we offer forgiveness when there hasn't even been an apology given. And I think this is a very important discussion spiritually, but also psychologically. I think that, and I know this conversation has happened many times, but just the gist of it is that we've been given a form of religion that teaches us to accept our suffering and our abuse. That is what was given to the enslaved African, especially in the time where we weren't even allowed to read the Bible. We were told that this is what you're supposed to do, and it was just an effort for us to accept our condition and to accept our oppression. And so that's been carried on. I think a lot of people have broken free from that, but it's clear that some people still are in that mind state. And to me, that term of forgiveness, I think people get really confused as to what that really is and what that really is supposed to be. When you offer a public display of forgiveness, it's not the same as forgiving someone in your heart. In fact, I think in that situation is surrender, and it's completely the opposite of spirituality in my view, because my view of spirituality, again, is not seeing yourself as separate from God and not seeing yourself as lesser than another human being. I think that response can only be given by someone who sees themselves as lesser than another human being and someone who doesn't know who they truly are. Because if someone has murdered your family member, it doesn't make any sense to publicly offer them forgiveness when you barely gotten a genuine apology, especially when the sentencing was just given. It's psychologically and spiritually out of order. And I think that's where a lot of our people are. I'm not going to say all of us, but a lot of us are.
Forgiveness is, in my view, is not for the other person.
Yes, but when you do it publicly, it is for the other person. That's what I'm saying.
I've never thought about it that way, Rhonda, that how you choose to display that forgiveness does say something about the programming that is in your mind. I want to say that off the bat, I already agree. I'm going to let that roll around my mind, and I'm going to try to separate those two things. As far as forgiving someone, as Jay would say, so that you can move on intrinsically, versus the whole dog and pony show that occurred during this court trial. Because now that set off a chain of events that is unprecedented in American law and in American courtroom, where now a judge comes down off of a bench to give the gift of a Bible to someone that she just presided over being convicted of murder and handed out sentencing, and then offers out the extension of a hug and an embrace to someone that is considered a convicted killer. America has never seen anything like that. And for it to happen in this case, it made a great deal of sense that the victim would be exactly who the victim is. And the victim's family would be exactly who the victim's family is. And the judge would be exactly who the judge is. And what I'm saying by all these things, extremely Christianized individuals. That makes sense. If we're supposed to be a Christian nation, we have never received that level of humanity based on anything Christian in this country, especially in our courtrooms, where, yeah, you put your hand on a Bible, but they hand out death penalties, especially to people who they know are innocent.
One of the first things that went through my head when I saw that, I just kept thinking of all the cases of Black women in particular in that situation, and just how demonized they are, you know, when they literally killed someone on accident, and how demonized they are, and how they just get the maximum sentence and no compassion is shown. It just kind of made me really emotional. And it's just, again, that's why I lean on self-love so much, because that type of display is a display to me of a lack of self-love. And when I speak of self-love, I speak of it on an individual level, but I also speak of it on a collective level of Black people loving other Black people. We don't show ourselves the same love that we show those who abuse us. It's the mindset of a woman in a domestic violence situation, where she shows love and affection and forgiveness to the person who is doing her the most harm, who is literally making her life a living hell. All the while, she is telling herself that she is stupid and she is less than and she deserves this mistreatment. And that's where we find ourselves again. And again, I think that's a spiritual issue too, is just not knowing who we really are. Because if we really knew who we were, we would not treat ourselves like that.
Again, being forced to forget your roots, your origin, being forced to forget. Now you know that you have been forced to forget. Now you know that you have been overwritten with foreign programming from a parasitic element, from a cannibalistic element. You know not only that you've been overwritten or reprogrammed, but you know why you've been reprogrammed. You know that you've been reprogrammed for subservience. To then, at the end of knowing both of those facts, still resign yourself to that place is mental retardation, brought on by acute fear, brought on from terrorism. And there is no peace in that place.
Correct.
Violence in spirituality, Jay, I know I didn't answer your question, and partly because I don't know how to answer your question, but I can tell you this. When you find out that one, you've been overwritten, and two, the purpose you've been overwritten for, you're going to have to make a decision to either choose to continue down that path or choose to stand up and refuse that path because there was something that's more original to you. And the people who have chosen to overwrite you are not going to let you go peacefully. So therefore, violence is inevitable. After all, if you look at the history of violence, the majority of the violence on this planet has been done by the state, only followed very closely by the church. And the church is usually there when the state is doing it, trying to convert and genocide people at the same time. So Western religion is a tool of war. Alkebu-Lan spirituality is a way to commune with your ancestors so that you can remember your history. And the more you do that, the more you can remember your history back to your first ancestor, which is great God. And those two things are very different.
The reason why I ask that question is I'm more concerned that we probably will have to use violence and at some point to make a change, or the changes that we need. Once we collectively kind of commiserate within ourselves and get ourselves together, we'll probably need to use force or violence in order to make appropriate changes for us to be from a position of power to make our own decisions.
No person that is involved with power would disagree with you. No person that truly knows how to govern themselves sovereignly would disagree with you. No person in their right mind would disagree with you. I would tell you who will disagree with you right now. Mm-hmm. In fact, I would leave it unsaid.
Might be me, actually. I think that violence is optional. I think for a long time, I strongly believed that our awakening would lead to war. And when I say to war, because we've already been in a war where we're actually fighting back.
That part.
And I've heard it said many times that it's necessary to get ourselves out of this condition. The only part of that I would disagree with is that I feel like if we tap into other parts of us, we'll see that we have options. There's not just one way to get ourselves out of this condition. There's many ways. And I think some things are going to happen simultaneously. I mean, I think when you talk about nation building, that term we throw around a lot. Well, part of a nation, having a nation is having an army, but there's also having an educational system. There's also having a health system. I just hate to see violence as that one thing that we have to do. I think that it is optional. It's probably going to happen. It's probably necessary, but I think necessary in addition to many other parts that must happen simultaneously.
The reason that Europe set out to colonize the world is to prevent violence in Europe. Europe knew that if they were to stay within their own coasts, their growing population would not be sustainable, and that it would lead to violent outbreak within Europe, in all of their major cities, whether it be France, whether it be Portugal, whether it be
Spain,
Britain,
England,
and all the rest of these people.
It's curious that many of us are shifting from the major world religions in that we have identified that it doesn't fit us, but yet we're very wary of our own spiritual system in that it's foreign to us. And the way that we have come to be introduced to it is through third party. And so it's mysterious. And I think that it may be even off-putting in that we're fearful of it.
There was a question asked earlier about what is keeping us from returning to our correct spiritual systems. And I agree that fear is the biggest thing. I think education, of course, is a big piece, but I've seen so many people that are as educated as possible with the information that we have on African spirituality, and they're still lacking. You know, I'm not seeing a reflection of someone who has the wealth of wisdom that comes from an African spiritual system. Our people, if left alone, would revert back to our natural selves. If we're thinking in a view of a cycle of time, we will ultimately revert back to where we were over time. Because I've met a lot of Christian people that are becoming much more spiritual and even unknowingly adapting things that we would liken to African spirituality. But the thing that I see stop a lot of people is fear, because they have an interest in it, but because of the way that they've been taught Christianity, they feel like, you know, that's of the devil, or I got to be careful with that. And I know that feeling, you know, from the time that I was a Christian, you know, this fear of going to hell. You know, a lot of people are still carrying that fear. And for those who are not in Christianity, a lot of people are fearing a lot of other things outside of hell, outside of turning against God, whatever it may be. And this fear is coming from a lot of places, but you can still see it even for those who have come out of Christianity, continuously having fear. And when I speak of fear, I'm also speaking of doubt, worry, uncertainty, those kind of things. It really keeps us from being in tune with our natural selves, which would bring us closer to an African form of spirituality.
I'd like to make the argument that all of those are violence. When you weaponize a religion, you bring into the spiritual realm your violence. And then you let people know that there will be rewards and punishments doled out by your control, and that the punishment for you not obeying is violence in the afterlife. It's terrorism in the afterlife. So now that you have terrorism to face in the afterlife for not obeying the Europeanized God, and you have terrorism to pay in the secular world for not obeying the European master, if both of those realms lead to violence, I'm still trying to figure out how we're going to get out of this without violence. Because I know that the moment we say no more, the very ethos of our oppressors, the very arrogance of our oppressors will dictate preemptive attacks on us. Because they're already attacking us every other way, including physically violent ways.
That's true.
So what makes us lose sight of the fact that when it's time to stand up and say enough is enough, that they will not organize a last-ditch effort to attack us violently? And we have examples of it. Whether it's the violent overthrow of a government, whether it's a coup d'etat, whether it's dropping a bomb in Philadelphia, whether it's the Rampart scandal in Los Angeles, whether it's policies passed by presidential offices that say any effort that African people in this nation should use to organize themselves should be combated, including the use of violence if necessary. This is public policies against us. That's
definitely what history has shown us. The only thing that I would say is that The violence that we would experience or that we would implement is completely dependent on us. You're absolutely right. Though that is what has happened throughout history for a very long time. I think one thing that we have not seen in history, and correct me if I'm wrong, is a unified African people. And I'm speaking globally. So if you can imagine, let's say, I probably don't have the exact numbers here, but let's say 3 white people in a room of 5 Africans. And let's say they've been beating up on these people for days. I'm just shortening it. 3 white people in a room of 100 Africans, no matter how many weapons you have, no matter what you got in your pocket, it's a different scenario. And that's just a very simple example, but what I'm saying is we can change the outcome even when it comes to violence. I think history has shown us that they react with violence. They don't care. They'll kill their own people in order to kill us. All those things. They love weapons. They're always thinking of new weapons in order to even the playing field because physically, spiritually, and mentally, they're not on the same playing field as us. So the weapons are a way to compensate for that.
I think we need to broaden our definition of violence to include self-defense by any means necessary. I think that when the word violence comes up, we automatically envision giving white people the ass whipping they deserve, just randomly. I want to bring that to the forefront of the conversation because whenever the word violence comes up, people in the liberal sphere start to worry. Well, are you just going to randomly
Django?
Oh, yeah, they're fearing the Django character. I think that the fear of violence or the discussion of violence is always shrouded in the idea that, well, there's going to be this mass attack preemptively from Alkebu-Lan people all throughout the planet. That's not the violence that I'm speaking about. That violence is not necessary. The violence that is going to be necessary is the violence used to combat and defend ourselves against the preemptive strikes that will come from the European oppressors when we decide we no longer want to be oppressed.
Any type of suggestion that we would just be acting out of revenge, I think that's an illusion of white people. I mean, the majority of black people I talk about who suggest violence, it's in order to get out of our situation. And I think that's what the majority of us want. I feel like we don't even have right now the time to think about revenge because we got to get out of the situation first, unless it's going to happen at the same time. Maybe a Nat Turner scenario would be something that kind of feels like both where, you're getting out of the situation, but it also kind of feels vengeful at the same time. But I think absolutely. And that's why I mentioned the Army, because I think, in nation building, that's the purpose of the Army is to, or military, however you want to define it, to defend and protect your nation. And that's kind of what I think more so in terms of violence. I don't even completely consider that to be violence. I think it's necessary, But I also think that we as a people have found ingenious ways to overcome situations. And I think we could do that again, not necessarily saying that that's what is going to happen, that we're going to come up with this brilliant idea to get out of this situation. Again, I think that there's going to be multiple things going on at the same time. And I don't think violence is exclusive. I just think that it's not going to necessarily happen in the way that some of us are imagining it at this current state.
Yeah, I don't believe it's going to happen in the way white people fear. I believe that there will be instances. I believe that there will be isolated pockets. I believe that there will be land reclamation without compensation. I believe that some of the youth who feel that they have been violated for long enough will walk up to a plantation owned by a stranger and say, it's time for you to go. But the funniest thing about all of these cases is that they always give them 3 days to leave. Even when they were reclaiming land in Zimbabwe, the Zimbabwean people would show up and say, you got to go. We're going to be back here every day until you leave. And then eventually the clock just kept running. And it's like, look, 3 more days and you got to go. And then them not taking those warnings seriously because of arrogance. You're in a land that you came in and took as a conqueror through violence. Now you are being given the opportunity to leave in peace and go back to the land that your ancestors came from to attack us, or somewhere else. But there's going to be change in this area today. And the arrogance of these people is, well, we're not going anywhere because our forefathers stole this land and gave it to us, and we've got the guns to defend it.
The known and successful uprisings, attempts to shift the paradigm have been coupled with spirituality. So spirituality is not something that we can circumvent if we're speaking of our advancement and being successful. So what does that look like?
As Shaba mentioned earlier, spirituality is something we never separated from all the other things that were the spiritual component to education. It was just something that was pervasive in every doctrine and every system that we had. I think what it would look like today, we've seen some examples throughout history that have been mentioned before. I think what it looks like today is really just us losing fear. I don't necessarily see any specific prayers. I think that there is a calling of the ancestors that's already begun, that many of us are doing on an individual level. But I really see it as us losing the fear and just doing what we know needs to be done right now. To me, that's a very spiritual thing. And I think, when it comes to violence, some religions have, or the way that we've been taught, those religions have taught us just no violence. There's no exceptions. And again, that's why I think spirituality is so important, because it gives us that knowing of when violence is needed and when it's not needed. And when you're doing things for a divine purpose, and I don't think anything is more divine than bringing the freedom of our people worldwide.
True spiritual enlightenment is the absence of fear.
Ashe, I agree.
Christians say this all the time. God and fear can't exist in the same space.
Amen. Preach.
Yeah, I first heard that from a Christian. I didn't understand it. I just, I was going along with the Christian thing, and it sounded great. God and fear can't exist in the same space. It sounded wonderful. Now I understand that because I study Alkebu-Lan spiritual systems, right? So if you are filled with the force of the Creator, you understand that you're an extension and a aspect of the Creator, and everything is you and you are everything, and that your ancestors have already shown you the way and are petitioning for you. And there's nothing to be fearful of. Superstition and fear go hand in hand. Superstition is what we were taught in place of Alkebu-Lan spirituality. We were taught those superstitions to turn us away from our ways. We were miseducated into superstitious behavior. And that's going to go hand in hand with fear, because superstition was created to create fear. But when I think of Kemetic people doing Kemetic work, I don't think of a fearful people. When I think of the Tunisians and Hannibal Barca crossing the Alps to fight Rome to a standstill, I don't think of fearful people using native Alkebu-Lan spiritual systems. When I think of Nat Turner, when I think of Denmark Vesey, when I think of Dessalines, I don't think of fearful people. And these are people that all used God in the equation for liberation through violence, Jay, with the absence of fear. So that is why we had to be disconnected from our Alkebu-Lan spiritual ways and given superstitious Western European Christianity, so that we would be fearful first of our earthly masters, enslavers, and then be ultimately fearful of their God, who was also prepared to enslave us in hell. And their God is the devil. Because I like to read through the scriptures and go through the comparisons of God and the devil in our minds and in the popular zeitgeist, and realize that the work that was done on this planet to put us in the position that we're currently in cannot be Christian work. So the God that they were serving in the Bible cannot be the Elohim of Genesis. It had to be another spiritual force.
For the Christians out there, you don't think that it's a corrupted version of it that has been misrepresented?
Where does God and wickedness against humanity share the same space?
In the Old Testament.
That's cool. The Old Testament is not Christianity.
It's Judaism.
Yeah.
Yes, it is.
No, it's not. It's the roots of Christianity, but it is not Christianity.
It is part of the zeitgeist of Christianity. It's the, oh, no, forget about that part, the Old Testament part. Just know the New Testament. That's what we want. I mean, that happened, but
I'm telling you, the only thing that Christianity takes from the Old Testament is the creation story. That's Genesis, the lineages, and some of the prophets that are used to reinforce Christianity. And of course, the Psalms. Those are songs, right? And the wisdom, the songs of Solomon's and the Psalms.
I think in response to Ev's question, or Loon's question, I think that the way that Christianity is right now in its present form, of course, that was presented through a manipulation of books and writings. Part of me wants to say, it was the way that it was presented to us, which I think is a big factor. But at the same time, I think that because it could be presented in such a way to promote our enslavement, it can also be presented in the opposite way. And I think one of the best examples is Marcus Garvey. Marcus Garvey was a Christian, and he presented Christian principles within his speeches, but he made sure to give our people a perspective of Christianity that would facilitate our liberation and nation building. I think that Christianity and any form of religion kind of just puts a box and filters on what spirituality is. I saw this visual recently, and I think it just sums it up great, is religion is like a fish in a fishbowl in the ocean. It's keeping you away from the vastness of spirituality. And being spiritual is just being that fish in the ocean without any fishbowl around you. So it puts layers on us, that keeps us entrapped and in a lot of ways enslaved. And as Shaba mentioned, it's been used as a weapon of war. So I think it can be used to promote things that facilitate our liberation and our freedom. But the way that it is, the way that the Bible set up, that damage has already been done. And I think that we can interpret it a different way, but it's already been set up to be as harmful to us as possible.
Every time I've said Christianity, I've always tried to preface it with the word Western or European. And if I haven't, then anywhere where I said it without it, let's go back and put it there. Christianity is used in the weaponized paradigm of Western cultures, of European cultures. There are forms of Christianity that are still in use today that do not serve Europe. Ethiopia is one example of that. I would even argue that Rasta is another form of another derivative of Christianity. Hebrew Israelites is another form. So this brings me back to a Jerry Rollins quote that says, "Christianize me if you may, but don't try to Europeanize me."
Dada Rhonda, we want to give you an opportunity to let us know anything that you're doing, anything that you want to promote, anything that you'd like to share.
Awesome. Thank you. One way that I communicate my messages is through my spoken word. If you are interested in seeing my spoken word or follow my social media pages, that can be found under Rhonda Sekhmet-Ra. That's RHONDA SEKHMETRA. Also, if you're interested in the Black Awakening Movement, you can find us on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Black Junction under Black Awakening Movement, and also visit the website blackawakeningmovement.com. And if you have any interest on starting your healing journey, I have a healing practice by the name of Lionheart Life Healing, and that can also be found at lionheartlifehealing.com and also on Facebook and Instagram under Lionheart Life Healing. Thanks.
As always, we are Kujenga. You can find us on kujenga.fm. That is the website. You can email us at info@kujenga.fm. We are also on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook at Shule Inc. because Kujenga is a subsidiary of Shule, the podcast arm of Shule. And we do have a Facebook page, Kujenga Podcast. You can listen to us on any major platform under Kujenga Podcast. That's Spotify, Google, Player FM, and iTunes Podcasts. Thanks for tuning in. And if you want to take us out with the mantra, Loon.
Kujenga Taifa Leo.
Build a nation today.